Yeah, so the idea behind their notion of balance, of patriarchal balance, is that it always moves between the violent and the nonviolent. In other words, it's kind of like a case of these people want to be violent, and then the people who want to restore the illusion of peace is what I would call it. They engage in hostilities towards the people who are using their violence and are out of control to then either kill them, subject them, subdue them, and then of course then you have that thing again. But because they don't saw, and this is really, I feel like this is a problem because if you actually think about it really deeply, the fact that there's this teeter tottering is itself an existence of an underlying problem, which is what is responsible for this cyclical violence and destruction that has killed so many people and hurt so many lives. And that is the main flaw of patriarchy and of male role essentially, which is that their idea of balance isn't to stop violence from happening or to find ways to solve problems peacefully in the long run. Their idea of it is whenever there is a violent force, there must be another violent force to counter it. So keep this in mind when we come to the topic of why this notion of balance is so dangerous, right? So it's not just because of this, it's because they are sustaining in their own ways a cycle of resentment, destruction, violence, and abuse. And when you sustain that, and you have, as we are, now an age of technological advancement, where people are have regular access to education like never before, there are growing attitudes of misanthropy and nihilism. I refuse to call it nihilism; it's nihilism, as far as I'm concerned. I don't. I think that's right. I hope. I heard somebody say nihilism once. I was like, "What the fuck? That sounds like somebody has a broken kneecap or something." So there's that. Getting back on track here. There are these elements here. There are these individuals who have, that we've seen them do it all the time. We see individuals. I remember I had a discussion once with a family member who just could not understand this concept, who always thought that human beings would strive for survival, and yet we see evidence of the opposite all the time. These mass shooters, they go out, and they're essentially throwing their lives away. They're throwing away because you don't kill seven, eight, whatever people and not go to prison for the rest of your life. So these people are throwing their lives away. They are endangering and are killing other people in the process. And they just don't seem to really value life at all. Now, what happens when you have a society or have people that devalue life to the extent where the violence becomes indiscriminate? The violence then starts to escape beyond the control of military institutions, of police institutions, of just the regular person who may have some good intentions or may not. What ends up occurring is that you develop and create these things called monsters, people who don't really care about anyone or anything. And this is the flaw with this kind of problem, with the idea of patriarchal balance, is while it does create a sense of balance in the way, and well, in the sense that it cancels out a larger war, it really, their idea of balance is basically just keeping a large forest fire from happening while at the same time maintaining attitudes, beliefs, and engaging in practices that keep lighting little flames, in the forest. And what ends up occurring, of course, is that over the passage of time, eventually one of these little flames becomes a big flame, and then it burns a huge section of the forest down. And what patriarchy does, or how it's designed, is it's designed in such a way to where whenever there is a big forest fire, somebody will come along and they'll be like, okay, well, it's time to turn out. It's time. This fire has consumed too many lives. It's caused too much destruction. So it's time to put out the fire. But they never actually put out the fires permanently. They just put out the fire that becomes big enough to involve enough people that it gains attention. This is very important. If you haven't been paying attention, please pay attention now. So now we look at the case of Hitler and Stalin, who were abused by their fathers. No one stopped them from doing this, and yet look what they went on to do. This is why it keeps happening, because if you don't address the micro problem, then how can you address the macro problem? I've seen some psychologists say that personality disordered people never harm any, they don't harm anybody outside of their family. But to me, this is an insult because this refuses to acknowledge the connection between the micro and the macro, which is what connects these two things. When does something small start to influence something large, right? And I think that one of the things we underestimate is how our treatment of an individual can shape the beliefs and opinions and actions that they take in respect to their power position, and especially in the ways that that person can shape other people's lives. So yes, the micro does affect the macro, if only in the sense of sort of a transference, where the abuse and pain that goes from that person is then translated in some other form and then imprinted on the population. And this is where patriarchy and this sense of male balance always creates problems, because their idea of it is, okay, if there's a nation doing this right, well, we'll cancel it out. Well, what happens if that nation happens to be aggressively expanding also has nuclear weapons? Well, if one nation calls another nation's bluff, what how can you stop conflict, right? So this idea of like nuclear weapons stopping conflict forever is very naive, and it didn't stop wars. Right? This idea that nuclear weapons stopped conflict. No, what it did was it just made it so that these nations with nuclear arms couldn't engage each other directly, because to do so would be self-defeating. However, they were still going after smaller nations or nations that had militaries that couldn't mount any kind of defense against their more complex ones. I mean, you take a look at the United States and its occupation of the Middle East or parts of the Middle East. You can take a look at the same thing that happened with Russia when it was in Afghanistan. There is this common pattern that you will observe if you pay close attention to it, of these individuals continuing with the violence and not cutting it out and not using it as a last resort. Because if it truly was a last resort, we would do whatever it took to avoid a war. And yet we don't. It's actually the opposite. We are regularly engaging these things. Now, here's where the actual serious danger comes in. What happens when somebody manufactures a nuclear miscalculation or somebody makes a bioweapon in the military and they decide they want to kill people or they want to kill billions of humans? Well, because we're a flawed species and because we are continuing to sustain this cycle, what will eventually happen, it's not a matter of if, but when it happens, is that there will be either somebody who is highly intelligent, has a lot of resources, has reasons for hating humanity, hating everybody. They will get into a power position either in the military or in politics to where they can influence things in such a way to manufacture a case of mass destruction. And this is where the idea of patriarchal balance completely fails. Because by sustaining this cycle, by continuing to rationalize violence as a solution to problems, they are generating monsters. And eventually these creatures, and you can see it in their media too, like if you pay attention to video games or whatever, there's always this delusion, this idea that forces must always cancel out, that there will always be a hero to stop the villain. I feel like this is actually, a call for help in a way from men who know deep down that they can't actually stop this from happening, that eventually, things will get outside of their control, that they will lose control, and that one of these individuals will capitalize off of their weaknesses, because it's another problem they do, right? Which is in patriarchies, because they're competitive, because they are sustaining this cycle, because they believe that a force must cancel out a force always, and it must be done in the most violent of ways. That's important too, because that'll come back to the Gynarchic view of balance later. Because they believe this, they also teach people to exploit each other's weaknesses. Well, what happens when you teach a monster how to exploit the weaknesses of others? What happens when they exploit your weaknesses? What happens when they find a way, they take a look at the system and they see, oh, I see the holes and the gaps, I see where somebody could really fuck this up for everybody, and they decide to go for it. And sadly, this isn't the worst example of this. This is the worst example. Only example. Here's another idea of the patriarchal notion of force and how it doesn't actually work. You have global warming. You have the planet becoming uninhabitable. I don't know how it is that people still cling. Maybe it's just like, again, it's a delusion, right? It's like men think, because they're raised with these video games, which are fun and entertaining. I play them myself. But to think that there will always be a Cecil Harvey to, Zemus or whatever, that there'll always be a Cloud to every Sephiroth, is very naive, very ignorant, and it sort of points to the existence of the problem, which is the rationalizations for violence itself that we continue to make for the sake of whatever cause it is, whether it's for the nation or for survival or this, that, whatever it is we're doing, it's always feeding into that. It always goes back to the surviving, or not necessarily thriving, but just staying alive. And this right here, this will likely be the death of humanity, or at least most people, unless this kind of affair has changed. Because you take a look at global warming, look at that. It's like we are the problem. Like we are human beings, but especially men, in the way they design these systems, because they can't deny they didn't design them and maintain them and sustain them in an era, especially when women did not have the power to really counteract this in any way. By the way, women make up most of the not terrorists, but what is it? The activists, the people who want to do something about the planet to preserve the natural order. So if we don't have a planet, obviously we won't exist. Now, the patriarchal notion of balance does nothing at all to deal with global warming. And see, this is part of their problem, right? Everything that they do is always thought of, the entire system is built upon the preconception, the notion that if he's going to be violent towards me, I have to be prepared to be violent towards him. Right? That's really what it comes down to. The only problem is that violence can't solve the problem of global warming, right? It can't. I mean, there's no way that violence, because we're the ones that are pumping that CO2 up into. This has to be solved by creativity, by innovation. It has to be solved by human beings collectively valuing and choosing to value life. But what happens when you keep devaluing life? What happens when you continue to find ways to put each other down, to abuse, to mock, to treat as if they're nothing special? Well, then you get this consequence. You get a world where people are just doing whatever they want to do, which, by the way, I'm not saying I'm free from this criticism either. I think all of us, to some extent, are guilty of this and not being the most responsible on the issue. But what I think is interesting is how this idea of balance doesn't even come into play. It doesn't even factor into whether the environment is preserved or not. And so what we end up seeing is that while there is a sense of balance that can be maintained for a period of time, although it's a little wobbly, because that's what I refer to it as. Yeah, the pen is staying in the middle of my finger, but it's wobbling. It can wobble. It's like doing this. It's wobbling and wobbling. So it's a wobbly form of balance. And the reason for it is because there's always people trying to pull you into war who want to start some shit. And then there's the other people that are like, fuck no, dude, this ain't worth it. So it's wobbly, wobbly, wobbly. And while they are so concerned, while this system is so intent on maintaining that wobbly form of balance, which could arguably not be balanced at all, and depending on your point of view, it is necessarily a form of balance, but it's very shaky. It never lasts. It always gets disrupted. And then, of course, you have this phenomenon that, what are they fucking supposed to do? I'm going to have to go to part 3.